By the year 1003, Basil II had made considerable territorial gains against the Bulgarian Empire of Tsar Samuel, in addition to his very impressive eastern conquest and his successful assertion of his authority over the recalcitrant military aristocracy of Anatolia. However, due to a lacuna in our sources, we are largely unable to view the progress of the war in the West for over a decade. When Skylitz's narrative resumes in 1014, we are on the eve of Basil's most iconic battle. In this video, the fourth of 5 on Basil's lengthy reign, we will witness Basil II commit one of the most famous atrocities in history, completely conquer and mostly integrate Byzantium's biggest geopolitical foe, and truly become the Bulgar-Slayer. We will explore issues ranging from what probably happened during the lost decade from 1003 to 1014, the battles and campaigns of 1014 to 1018, and Basil's administrative arrangements, which, while not perhaps as tight and uniform as most students of Byzantium have imagined, were still capable of enduring for some 160 years. In this episode, Basil II will peak so hard that it will blind at least 15,000 of his contemporaries. Let us begin our coverage of Basil's Bulgarian War by looking at the most difficult part of it first. We know basically nothing about the years 1003 to 1014. Most of our sources say nothing about the progress of Basil's campaigns in Europe, and the one source who does mention it, Skylitz's, says simply that Basil II invaded Bulgaria every year. This seems quite plausible, but he doesn't really go into much detail. He seems to be in a hurry to get to the famous Battle of Kleidion. There are some scholars who have proposed that there was actually a truce during this time, and that Skylitz's report about Basil invading every year was incorrect. Most likely, however, the war did continue, and we can make that guess pretty plausibly based on the fact that there are some important shifts in the map between 1003 and 1014, and these shifts, by the way, seem to show that the Bulgarians were making a comeback during this time. In 1003, the Bulgarians were not in a great spot, but in 1014, they were much more competitive. We also see that there are a lot of new generals on the scene who were not present in 1003, and the presence of a lot of these new officials heavily implies that the war had continued, and that due to death, aging out, or people becoming weary, that Basil and Samuel had been swapping their respective generals. If the war did start back in 991, then it would be a 27-year non-stop war, which would make it the longest in all of Roman history, according to Anthony Caldelis. Of course, there are some people like my friend Sean who would say that Byzantium does not count as Rome, but let's not get into that bag of worms right now. We already had that issue on a live stream. Let's consider what the situation was in 1014 when Skylitz's resumes a detailed account of the war. It is pretty clear that despite Basil's entire attention being on the West, that Samuel and the Bulgarians had still managed to make some fairly considerable gains. One of the major conquests of the earlier part of the war is when Basil captured the city of Beroia, but it would appear that at some point over the lost decade, Samuel had managed to recapture this important city. We also see that Samuel's Bulgarian forces had several cities in Macedon that they had garrisoned, and that there really were no clear-cut frontiers or front lines of this war. Armies from both sides campaigned in the core territories of the other. In fact, one of the frontiers was not all that far from Thessalonica, which was the empire's second city, at least the second city in Europe. We also see Basil II and Samuel are squaring off directly against one another. We have no idea how many times that had happened over the lost decade. A lot of times they probably fought each other's generals more so than risking a direct confrontation. There are some new generals in the field who will be quite important to the events of the next 4 years. One of them is Nicephorus Xiphias. Another is the Dukes of Thessalonica, Theophylactus Bataniades. Both of them are now senior Byzantine field commanders and officials. There will be a couple others who emerge as well over the course of this 4-year period. I don't know if they started out in the West or if they were transferred later, because they only appear in the narrative once they get a major command. As for the Bulgarians, they had also produced 2 new and capable commanders, these men being Ibatsis and Krakas. As I mentioned above, when Skylitzes lifts the curtain on the Bulgarian War in 1014 and we resume a detailed narrative, we see that Samuel and Basil are facing off against each other, each at the head of a fairly considerable field army. As was not uncommon during this war, the Bulgarians were holed up in a pass, this time Kleidion Pass, and the Byzantines with a superior army were not able to get at them without endangering themselves. This was a fairly typical impasse, and basically the challenge was whether the Byzantine commander would do sufficient scouting and have sufficient patience. Otherwise, they would face a disaster. And even after this battle, this tactic continued to be standard fare for the Bulgarians, and also continued to have success. Kleidion Pass, by the way, is located between the Strymon and the Axios valleys. By this point, both of the major powers knew all of the various passes, but it would seem that, interestingly enough, the Bulgarians might have been a little bit better at geography than the Byzantines. That's just kind of my impression of this overall. At any rate, what Samuel did not count on was that he could be struck from the south and rear. A new general who makes his debut in history at this juncture is Nicephorus Xiphias. He is an official who is empowered to the south of Kleidion Pass, and he finds a path forward into Samuel's rear. He takes this path and launches a surprise attack on the Bulgarian army on July 29th, 1014. And since Samuel's forces are oriented in the wrong direction, their position is completely untenable, and they are forced to surrender. All 14,000 to 15,000 of the men give up, but in the ensuing chaos, Samuel and his son were able to slip away. However, this is still a monumental victory, perhaps not quite war-winning, but still a pretty damn good victory, especially since we've seen that Basil has lost a few key cities here and there over the last decade, so this would feel pretty good. Before we stray too far afield from the battle itself and Nicephorus Xiphias' role in that battle, it is worth mentioning that he only appears in history once again, and we'll cover that in part 5. Suffice it to say that not only did he just appear, but he just peaked and pretty much did everything positive that he will do in his career, at least so far as we know. After the battle on July 29th, Basil decided that extreme measures were called for. This could be an indication of his desperation and his willingness to do literally anything to bring this war to a successful conclusion. What he decided to do is a fairly unique atrocity and something which is probably more cold-blooded than just simply killing the men. He took the prisoners, 14 or 15,000 of them, divided them up into groups of 100. 99 of them were blinded in both eyes, and the lucky one man would only be blinded in one eye, so that they could serve as guides to lead their compatriots home. Why, you might ask, would he do this rather than simply killing them or enslaving them or sending them off as colonists to some other part of his empire, which was a more standard practice? And indeed, there are scholars who think that Basil took these men and sent them off to the east or somewhere like that. But the reason is actually that he figured out this would do more damage to Bulgarian society if he created a large group of beggars who would be an economic burden on Tsar Samuel and their families. He figured that this was the more cold-blooded move which would strategically weaken his enemies the most. We also have to remember that while this does seem rather extreme and it's pretty unique, this was absolutely in keeping with both the cruelty of the age and of Basil II. As we have noted in previous videos, this man was not warm or cuddly, and he was capable of doing literally anything it took to achieve his objectives. This is where he took it to the absolute extreme. And by the way, apparently this was a policy that he decided would continue. For the rest of the Bulgarian conflict, he will blind all of the prisoners that he takes, no exceptions. The loss of a field army was definitely a major blow to Bulgaria, and the stunning manner in which Basil decided to destroy this army would have definitely been an economic shock as well as something of a moral shock. Although it easily could have had the opposite of the intended effect by showing the Bulgarians not that resistance was futile, but that they had no choice but to fight to the literal death, that this was an existential war. It is important to note that after this battle, as we'll see, Bulgarian morale as a whole was not broken. So this battle in of itself was actually not decisive. It was only some of the aftermath of this battle which made Kleidion, in retrospect, a decisive event. Basil's exploitation of Kleidion in the immediate aftermath of the battle is surprisingly pedestrian, if not downright disappointing. Elsewhere, the Dukes of Thessalonica, Theophylactus Botaniades, managed to defeat an attack against the city of Thessalonica, and then he joined up with the emperor. Basil then sent him to clear out some of the forts and the passes leading to the city of Strumica, which was clearly his major objective. This would be the prize that he gained by clearing out the major field army under Tsar Samuel. However, Botaniades, as he was conducting this campaign after taking a few forts, was ambushed and killed. As I mentioned, the Bulgarian army was not demoralized by Kleidion, and if anything, may have been invigorated by it through anger. This caused Basil to realize that Strumica was not a viable target at this time, so he decided to go for a lesser target and also march by a safer route. So he decided to go after the coastal city of Melnik in the northeast. Here he was able to utilize the negotiating skills of the eunuch Sergius to take the city, and then he retired behind the frontier. All in all, this was, as I said, at best a pedestrian follow-up of what should have been a dramatic victory, and the loss of the Dukes of Thessalonica, Botaniades, if anything, helped to really take the sheen off that victory and take it from being a major victory to just a rather humdrum victory. The true decisive moment in the Bulgarian War was not the Battle of Kleidion or the underwhelming pursuit that Basil mounted after the battle. Rather, it was the death of Tsar Samuel, Basil's great antagonist. Samuel and his son had managed to escape the trap at Kleidion, and both of them had arrived back safely at Prilep. After Basil had blinded all of the prisoners, they slowly marched home. Samuel no doubt knew about their fate well before he saw them, but supposedly on October 6, 1014, when the army of mutilated men made it to Prilep, Samuel saw their condition, and he dropped dead from horror. People have debated whether this was the truth or whether this was a poetic exaggeration. It's hard to say. By this point, Samuel was at least 70 years old. He could have died of any number of things. This is also a man who has been campaigning hard for decades at this point, so he is worn out with age and wear and tear, and such a shock could easily have accounted for his death. What we learn when he dies is that his personality and his status as this iconic figure within the Bulgarian Empire was very much the beating heart of the revived Second Bulgarian Empire. Without Samuel, the Bulgarian cause is effectively in a zombified state. This is not to say that the Bulgarians did not continue to fight reasonably well. But it is to say that once Samuel was off the scene, there really was no new great figure for the Bulgarians to rally around. His immediate successor was Gavril Radomir, his son, but he lacked the same kind of support that his father had had, and as we'll see, he didn't really have a very long career. As Kaldelis and other Byzantine scholars have observed, it is pretty apparent from the sources that Basil did not see Kleidion as a decisive victory at first. As I mentioned earlier, the one setback in losing Bataniades had caused him to really lessen the scale of his campaign, and he had not really pushed as deeply as he could have. When he learned that Samuel was dead, however, Basil realized that now was the opportunity that he had been looking for. He hurriedly took his troops out of winter quarters and put together a winter campaign. At this time, he managed to capture the city of Prilep, meaning that Gavril Radomir and his court had to flee, and he also took the city of Stip. He returned to Thessalonica in early January 1015. In my opinion, based just on the circumstantial evidence, I believe that Gavril Radomir's decision to not defend Prilep and instead fall back in the face of the Imperial army was what doomed his reign, and ultimately what did the most to undermine the Bulgarian crown and its unifying ability. Had he fought and lost at the capital, I believe that he would have had a much better chance in the long run of gaining legitimacy and grinding the Byzantines to a halt. Eventually, Basil, who was getting up there in age, would die, and his successor might prove to be unwilling to keep the war going. So there was still a chance, I believe, for Gavril Radomir to keep the Bulgarians together, but his decision to run before the army really started to undermine the credibility of Samuel's kids in the eyes of the generals and nobles of Bulgaria. By the summer of 1015, the new Tsar Gavril Radomir was trying to advance peace overtures to Basil, but before those negotiations could get anywhere, he was murdered by his cousin, who then took the throne in his place. The new usurper was Ivan Vladislav, and although he will not have a ton of success over the next few years, he will become an iconic figure in Bulgarian history. Indeed, his influence is great enough that the statue that you see on the screen is actually in modern Macedonia. Not to be confused with the Greek part of Macedonia. Let's not get into that. That's a whole issue that we can best leave for another discussion. At any rate, though, Ivan Vladislav also offered to surrender to Basil, but unlike his cousin, he was not being sincere, and he was hoping to lure the Byzantines into an ambush. Basil II, for his part, was also not negotiating in complete good faith. He pretended to accept a surrender in order to try to assassinate Vladislav, but for whatever reason, his assassins were not able to take care of the new Tsar. So at this point, neither side would be willing to do much negotiating for the foreseeable future, and the war was destined to continue. By the time that the 1015 campaigning season opened, Basil realized that now was the time to strike and finish off Bulgaria once and for all. His goal was to defeat Ivan Vladislav, his generals, and to integrate their territory into the empire. He returned to Pelagonia in 1015, this being one of the core territories of Bulgaria, and at this point he made it standard practice to blind prisoners as a matter of course. I'm sure that for the Bulgarians, this did give them license to commit counter-atrocities, but also this would be the kind of thing which, in light of how much success the Byzantines were having and how little the Bulgarians were having, would very much wear down their willingness to continue to sacrifice themselves for nothing in the long run. Basil managed to capture the important city of Ohrid, and then he pursued Ivan Vladislav to the west coast. Vladislav was attempting to lay siege to the port of Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës, but this was not to be because Basil arrived. I imagine this had to be something of a shock for Vladislav, who probably didn't expect to see Basil that far afield. Elsewhere, one of Basil's subordinates was ambushed and destroyed by a new Bulgarian general, Basils. Rather than continuing to pursue Vladislav deeper and deeper into enemy territory, which he and his forces were unfamiliar with, Basil instead turned around and gave chase to Basils. However, he and his men were unable to catch Basils, so Basil returned to Constantinople in January of 1016. We don't know a lot of details about Basil's 1016 and 1017 campaigns, but these campaigns as a whole, including the operations of Basil's generals, were clearly key to continuing to break Bulgaria's spirit. In late 1016, Basil mounted an unsuccessful siege of Pernik, which lasted for 3 months. This does show, however, that the Bulgarians were not quite beaten yet, as they were able to hold out against Basil in person. In the spring of 1017, Basil decided to enter Macedonia, where he took a fort at a place called Longus, a now-lost site. Presumably, this was a place where there was a Bulgarian garrison, and Basil must have stormed the fort with his army. He took 1/3 of the loot for himself, while giving 1/3 to his regular troops and another third to the Varangians. The regulars here would have probably outnumbered the Varangians by 2 to 1, so the Varangians were being paid more than the average soldier. However, they also had more combat value, as seen in their role in almost every major victory that Basil ever had. In 1017, Basil also dispatched David Arianides and Constantine Diogenes to Pelagonia, while he himself advanced on the city of Vlastoria. However, when he arrived at Vlastoria, he realized that the city was far too fortified for him to be able to take easily or without heavy casualties, so he decided to fall back. Around this time, he seems to have learned that the Bulgarian general Crocus was attempting to form an alliance with the Pechenegs. If the Pechenegs were brought into the war, this would have extended the life of Bulgaria by giving them fresh manpower. So this is not something that Basil was keen to see happen, and he seems to have managed to conduct negotiations successfully to make sure that the Pechenegs stayed home. Perhaps he sent them some of his loot or something of that nature. As had become his custom over the last few years, Basil returned to either Constantinople or Thessalonica in January before setting out again in March or April and resuming his campaign. When he returned to Constantinople in January of 1018, I doubt that Basil thought this would be the last year of the war, or that he would be able to avoid any major fighting during the entirety of the year. However, that was exactly how things worked out, and once again, as with Samuel's death, the cause was the death of the Tsar and the consequent loss of support among the Bulgarian people for the war itself. In February, Ivan Vladislav was killed in action while leading a failed assault against Dyrrhachium. The death of the last claimant to the crown led to a mass wave of surrenders by key generals, which only snowballed as Basil marched into Bulgaria to receive the surrender of various officials. The rest of the year would basically be spent receiving surrenders, handing out titles, appointing administrators, and collecting loot and treasuries. So, all in all, 1018 was probably the best year of Basil's life. If I had to describe the year 1018 in a sentence, it would be that it was Basil's grand reception. In this year, he traveled to Bulgaria, and rather than fighting battles as he'd been doing for almost his entire adult life, he instead received the surrender of the various generals and administrators of the Bulgarian state, and in exchange he received them into his service. He spent quite a bit of time this year and in the following years setting up the administration of Bulgaria. We don't know the exact dates of when he made different decisions administratively, but knowing how decisive Basil was, my guess is that most of the major decision-making was already completed by the time that 1018 came to a close. The pattern was that when a Bulgarian would surrender a city or a fort, he would then receive an imperial title and now be directly beholden to Basil. This was important because, remember, Basil had a somewhat contentious relationship with the military aristocracy of Anatolia, and this provided him with an alternative power base. As we'll see later on, he will also have another new power base that results from this war as well. Basils, for his part, did not surrender, but the other great general on the Bulgarian side, Crocus, did. He surrendered the city of Pernik, one of the places that Basil had tried and failed to capture during this late stage of the war. Crocus was received into the imperial service, but as for Basils, he had the fate of being captured by the Byzantine general Eustathius Dufnamiles, who was the governor of Ohrid. Dufnamiles had Basils blinded, and Basil rewarded him by promoting him from Ohrid to the nice coastal city of Dyrrhachium, where he would be much more independent because he was more or less out of sight and out of mind from where Basil would be operating for the most part. So now Bulgaria had really ceased to exist, and it was just a matter of piecemeal surrenders. Probably a pretty busy year for Basil, but as I mentioned earlier, probably the best year of his entire life. As I mentioned above, we don't have a precise timeline for how Basil set up the imperial administration of Bulgaria. I think that there is a case to be made, however, for distinguishing between immediate arrangements and more long-term arrangements. In the immediacy of 1018, Bulgaria was not really integrated into the empire as it had freshly surrendered. Also, there were still a lot of wounds and quite a bit of animosity between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians. Knowing that, Basil decided to appoint David Arianides as the first Katapano of Bulgaria. Effectively, Arianides was more or less a viceroy, someone with plenipotentiary powers which encompassed the military and the political spheres, and he commanded an occupying army. Basil also decided at this time to grant imperial titles to all of Samuel's surviving family members and then send them off to Constantinople. This did mean that they received imperial salaries and that they would be taken care of for the rest of their lives, but effectively they would be under house arrest for the rest of their existence. This was something of a gilded cage for them, and all of them would be forced to participate in Basil's triumph late in 1018. After 22 years of captivity, John Chaldus, who had been the Dukes of Thessalonica, was liberated, and I believe he went home. Basil probably wasn't that excited to see him because he hadn't seen him for decades, and regarded the man as a failure, but I'm just making assumptions there. Byzantine POWs, many of whom had been there for years, were then given the option to either return home or to stay there. Most likely, many of them had created families with Bulgarian women, so perhaps at this point, Bulgaria felt more like their home, or at least they had reasons to be there. And that also gets into one of the more thorny issues when it comes to long-term stays for POWs. Sometimes they do make a new home for themselves and adapt to the conditions that they're in. Something that we don't often see acknowledged in sources, but something that I think is always something we should keep in mind. So that is one detail in all of this that I found to be very interesting and illustrative. Basil's grand reception took up most of 1018. He toured around the core areas of the Bulgarian Empire with his Varangian Guard, bestowing titles, establishing forts, setting up garrisons, appointing officials, etc. And this was how he spent the majority of his year. For the Varangians, this was probably fairly boring, although Basil did share some of the treasures with them, so I guess it was still lucrative. Basil himself, of course, did not travel to the northern extremities of the Bulgarian realm, nor did he reach the far western areas, and neither did his generals. Some of those areas still formally surrendered, but it is unclear exactly how long the Byzantines took to establish a formal presence there, or for Byzantine tax collectors or governors to arrive on the scene. And even when they did arrive, it is not all that clear how much authority they actually had. Toward the end of the year, Basil decided to make a detour to Athens in order to visit the Parthenon. At this time, the Parthenon had been converted into a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary rather than the goddess Athena, and he decided to thank the Virgin for his victory, thus making him the first sitting emperor to travel that far south in Greece since the time of Constans II, who I believe only visited Athens because he was on his way to Sicily. So that is an interesting side note, and it kind of shows you what the priorities of the emperors were. Greece proper, the old heartland of Hellenic civilization, was an afterthought for the emperors, even though Greekness apparently was a major part of Byzantine identity at this time. It's a fairly fascinating state of affairs. And now we get to the second most thorny issue in the Balkans, aside from ethnicity, and that is the related issue of borders. What did Basil conquer, and how much color did he actually put on the map? According to Caldelis, there are reasons to believe that the conquests were exaggerated by the sources, and that Basil more or less contented himself with the core territories of Bulgaria and didn't really go too much beyond that. It is safe to say that those two areas, the part of Bulgaria that Zemskis had held in the east and the more inland areas, both fell to the Byzantines, but I am of the belief, following the chronicle of the priest of Dioclea, that the conquest did include Serbia, Bosnia, and Dalmatia. My qualification for that is that while these areas did ostensibly join the Byzantine Empire, the level of imperial authority in these areas was rather loose, and we should not overstate the degree of imperial presence here. So to say that he added it to the empire, I think, is technically correct, but again, he probably was not deriving all that much revenue, and he most likely did not have all that much control over what happened on the coast of, say, Dalmatia. Although Basil was an exceptionally stubborn man who was willing to blind 15,000 people in a single day in order to achieve his objectives, he did have some degree of tact, and he realized that in order to keep the people of Bulgaria compliant, he would have to govern with a relatively light hand and respect their local traditions. So, unlike in the more established themes of the core territories, say Cappadocia or Greece, Basil had arrangements set up which were fairly loose. He also made sure that the command structure was flexible, since he didn't really know what the future might hold in terms of potential revolts or invasions from powers that the Byzantines were not all that familiar with, since their borders now extended so much more to the north and west than they had previously. Basil allowed local Bulgarian customs, such as the payment of tax in kind rather than in coin, to continue unabated. Caldelis believes that this was part of a gradual transition plan, where the Bulgarian economy would monetize and integrate with the larger Byzantine economy over time. I think that sounds about right, and it would also provide for a way to integrate Bulgaria slowly over time without arousing a great deal of local animosity. Gradual changes tend not to create the same kind of blowback that a radical change might. So, I believe that this is largely how Basil went about trying to subjugate these new areas and assimilate them into the empire. And now let us consider the legal status and social standing of Bulgarians within the larger Byzantine Empire. So we already talked about maps, now let's get into the thorniest of all issues when it comes to anything in Eastern Europe, ethnicity, everyone's favorite topic. It would seem that there were some reservations among Byzantine officials about viewing their new Bulgarian subjects as fellow Romanoi. It is not clear exactly how far these reservations went or what impact they had. We don't have any Bulgarian sources which tell us how the Bulgarians felt about their new status, but I don't think it takes a great deal of imagination to imagine that after all of the blindings, not to mention just the general pattern of warfare going back to before Basil's time, that the Bulgarians almost certainly had to regard the Byzantines with little less than frothing hatred. Caldella says that due to cultural differences, the Bulgarians were not viewed as full members of the Byzantine world, but then again, he does think that a Greek identity was key to what it meant to be a Romanos at this time, which is debatable. Not everyone agrees with that. There are other scholars who look at things in a more legalistic sense, and they think that citizenship was a legal package. And I think that this was still very much the case, at least on paper. So my take on this is that it is likely that, officially speaking, the Bulgarians were equal subjects. However, due to the decades of bad blood, blindings, and other events, there was a deep-seated prejudice that went both ways, and I can only imagine that this was not a very neat or tidy relationship. Basil, for his part, did try to ease tensions by creating some kind of representational marriages between Bulgarian and Byzantine nobles, hoping that this would show a form of unity. It's also worth mentioning that both the Byzantines and Bulgarians were Orthodox, and that Basil demoted Ohrid to an archbishopric, but did allow them to somewhat do their own thing, even if the second archbishop there was from Byzantium rather than a native Bulgarian. But again, this is a thorny issue, and I'm sure, as with anything involved in Eastern European history, there will be somebody in the comments who claims to know the precise answer to this question and also has the definitive map which no one can possibly contest. So I look forward to seeing that when it inevitably occurs. As we saw in parts 1 and 2, Basil II was a late bloomer. It not only took him a while to get a firm hold of the reins of power, but it also took him a while to figure out exactly how to govern and also how to be an effective military commander. However, once he got the hang of it, he proved to be quite extraordinary. It was only in 1018 when he truly peaked. I suppose it makes sense that a late bloomer would also be late to peak. By 1018, Basil had achieved what was for him a 32-year quest. Back in 986, as a young, headstrong emperor, he had been defeated and humiliated at Trajan's Pass. Now in 1018, his great rival Samuel was dead, and Basil now ruled over the entirety of Bulgaria. He had done more and conquered more in Bulgaria than any previous emperor, including John Zimisces, whom Basil regarded as something of a usurper. While he did not quite succeed in incorporating all of Bulgaria during his reign, and his successors, who, spoiler, mostly sucked, didn't really further the project too much, the Byzantine hold on Bulgaria did prove to be durable, and it was only when the empire started to experience serious problems 160 years later that Bulgaria was able to break away from the empire and become independent once more. As for his sobriquet of Bulgar-Slayer, it was only during the years after 1003 that Basil was able to earn that sobriquet through some truly brutal and horrific actions, which we have already described in detail here. Basil's infamous decision to blind the captives at Kleidion remains his most famous decision, for better or worse, and I think one of the most shocking moments in all of medieval history. It's actually fairly surprising to me that this dramatic event is not more heavily featured in general histories of the Middle Ages. I suppose that's because most medieval histories, at least in Western classrooms, tend to exclude Byzantium. I say that Byzantium's best case for being reincorporated into that larger narrative is Basil's action at Kleidion, 1, and then 2, the entire career of Justinian II, just the whole thing. But that's just my personal appeal to the people who control the textbooks on the history of the Middle Ages, as taught in most survey classes. By 1018, Basil was already 60 years old, quite old by the standards of the time. However, he had no intentions of slowing down. The man was still clearly full of vim and vigor, as we will see, and he was very much willing and able to embark upon new opportunities. Next time in Part 5, we will see Basil's final campaigns in the East and his final ambitions, which were never quite to come to fruition, in Italy, of all places. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and remember, just because you're a great emperor doesn't mean you're a good person. Blinding 15,000 people to earn a sobriquet and a place in history is not cool.